Guys, mobility drills, stretching drills, before training lower body, before training upper body. Well, over the last 15 years, I've tried them all. What have I seen to be the most effective? I've read the research. I understand the research. We've got to look at, are you doing 1 rep max lifting? Does the research point to turning off certain mechanisms that are involved with neurological recruitment for maximal lifting? Are we talking about people that are beginning their stretching journey? Is performance really going to be affected for somebody who's a beginner through to intermediate? Of course, when we get up to like seriously advanced, competitive, professional level, the research pointing towards mechanisms being affected by doing some level of stretching. But we've got to remember, what's the most amount of clients that we deal with on a day-to-day basis? The normal clients that we deal with are tight, but does it mean that they all need to stretch? So, I'm not saying this is wrong. I'm not saying mobility drills are wrong. But I want to just get your mindset to think a little bit differently. A muscle that's often always tight. Let's look at this upper body. So we've got the pecs, we've got the delts, we've got the biceps that can contribute to internal rotation, the lats, we've got the trap tightness, and we've got people here. Every time they train, they're stretching their pecs, they're stretching their pecs. But then they come to press and everything tightens up again. What's the issue with that? Is it tightness of the pecs? Is it tightness of the biceps? Or is it inactivity? Is it weakness? Is it understimulation from the mid traps, the lower traps? Is it underactivity from the rear delts? Maybe there's some neurological impingement from something that you've done over the years through injury. Maybe you've dislocated a shoulder 10 years ago. Maybe those muscles are actually locked on and tight because they're protecting something. One thing you need to think about is stretching mobility drills is not the fact that what mobility drills do you need to do, but what actual stability, what actual activation exercises you need to do. For example, over the years I've done a lot of stretching for my chest with my shoulder injuries. Over the years I've done a lot of adductor stretching, a lot of ball work to release the glutes because they're very tight. But over the last few years I've become more aware that every time I stretch, what I'm trying to do is release something that's actually going into protection mode, that's only going to go back into protection mode as soon as I start squatting again. So let's look at the squat. If I'm going to squat down and squat back up, and my hips are dropping into internal rotation, they're caving in, all right? My body's actually going towards, it's basically moving away from where I'm unstable to a protected mechanism. But that's going to impair my ability to extend through the hips on the way back up. So what's going to facilitate that hip extension is if my external rotators and extenders were fired up. So maybe I could concentrate more on firing up the hip extenders, the rotators, the abductors, which actually contribute to all the stability around my hip. And to that degree, when I actually go down into a squat pattern, instead of collapsing at this hip, I'm actually a lot more stable because I've activated the muscles which are very weak. Now, there are many ways in which a muscle becomes deactive. A muscle still kind of functions, but it's not functioning as part of the chain because something's tight. What about when I'm bench pressing? The limiting factor behind a bench press is your ability to stay retracted. So prior to doing any pressing movement, would it therefore not make sense to actually look at everything at the back and look at all the videos that I've posted about lower trap stability, rear delt activation? Isometric contractions are some of the best ways to initiate or contract and get a muscle to become activated. So simply doing an isometric contraction for a rear delt movement, an isometric contraction for a lower trap movement, or even performing those exercises prior to doing some of your pressing movements. Similarly to the hips, getting into this abducted or external and abducted position to get the glutes to fire. What you also don't understand or won't really relate to is if you're constantly internally rotating, you may have switched off the hip flexors. And instead of actually trying to stretch your hip flexors out because they're tight, it may mean that the hip flexors need activating. So it will take too long on a YouTube video to go through every joint, every muscle, what activation drills you need to do, what things you need to look out for, and what things you need to fire. So my best bit of advice to you is If everything needs stretching all the time and it's always the same joints and you're always picking up the same niggles, it's not necessarily mobility drills that you're after. It's actually everything that's not firing, opposing or opposite those joints. And how you can find that out is by finding somebody that's skilled in some of the neurological or muscular activation techniques. And a lot of very, very good physiotherapists will know how to test a muscle, how to test a muscle at the proximal range, how to test a muscle at the distal range. So for example, you might want to look at the rectus femoris for the quads and be able to assess it from a distal or a proximal range and be able to see whether the muscle's firing. And if you're therefore going to come into something like a squat or a hack squat or a leg press, you want all your quad muscles to be firing. And if they're not firing, you're going to start shifting and moving around and something's going to get tight. So someone that's working with you physiotherapy-wise or therapy-wise could actually say, right, here is the muscles in your sequence that are not firing right. Prior to training, let's get them fired up so they come into the sequence of all the exercises. And to be honest with you, when it comes to bodybuilding, you want things to be firing. So if you're having them tested on a regular basis, you know what's firing, what's not firing, and you'll find you'll have a damn sight better workout if you focus a lot more on getting muscles fired up and getting muscles activated that especially are not engaged or active at this time. Stretching has its place. Stretching for recovery, stretching, mobilizing. If your quads are tight, or if you feel something's just gunked up, especially from training with a lot of metabolites from lactic acid, doing some stretching, foam rolling is not a bad thing. When it comes to training, you really need to think about what's also not firing and what muscles aren't getting involved in the sequence. So I hope that helped. Again, you might have been hoping for me to get some mobility drills in here, but I thrown a little bit of a curveball because I want to challenge you and I want you to start understanding more about activation as well as mobilization.